Hey friends, welcome back to the Happy Homestead. I'm Amanda and today is another cheese making day. We are going to be making Dill Havarti. This is on page 208 of the Home Cheese Making book. If you've been following along here in our cheese series, we started out with learning all about the cultures and the types of milk, right? And the equipment you need. Then we moved on to some of those softer cheeses, getting our feet wet into cheese making. And now we're in our hard cheeses. This is Dill Havarti. This is actually a Havarti recipe. I'm making it a Dill Havarti. Is one of my favorite cheeses. I remember I was first introduced to it when I was probably 16 or 17 years old. I worked in a little gourmet deli bakery, and they had this sandwich. I think it was called the turkey stack, and it was 2 pieces of wheat bread with herbed mayo, sliced turkey, a piece of Dill Havarti, sprouts, and roasted red peppers. It was my favorite sandwich. I haven't forgotten it obviously since, but it was that sandwich that made Dill Havarti towards the top of my list of my favorite cheeses, and so that's what we're going to make today. This recipe calls for 4 gallons of milk, so this is one of the recipes in the book that does go a little bit higher in your gallons and what you need as far as making this cheese, but don't fear. I'm actually having this and I'm only using 2 gallons. So you can easily go to 4 gallons once you have a pot big enough and you feel comfortable with that. But we're gonna go with 2 gallons today and have that recipe. So 2 gallons of milk. We're using our calcium chloride diluted in filtered non-chlorinated water. We're using I'm gonna say this for splitting this recipe, right? So we're using a packet of mesophilic starter. We're going to be using our rennet in non-chlorinated water, cheese salt, and we're gonna use our saturated brine again. If you saw, we did that for, I think that was the Manchego and the Montasio. And so we're basically heating our milk up to 86, stirring in the calcium chloride and then the culture, letting it rehydrate. And then we're gonna let that ripen for about 45 minutes. Then we're gonna add our rennet and let it sit undisturbed for 35 minutes before we start cutting our curds. So I've already got my 2 gallons on the stove. Let's start this process. I've had it sitting on the stove for just about 30 minutes or so. So it hasn't really come up to too much temperature. It's at 46. So again, we need to get this up to 86. I'm just stirring because I'm using raw milk, right? The cream does rise to the top. So I like to just make sure that my cream is as much mixed in as possible. And we'll bring this up to 86 and then we'll add our calcium chloride and our culture. We are right at 86 degrees. Turn the heat off. I'm going to pour my calcium chloride diluted in the non-chlorinated water through. Really mix that in nicely. And remember, I'm doing 2 gallons, so I'm only using half a packet of mesophilic culture. I'm gonna let that sit for a couple of minutes, let the powder rehydrate on top of the milk, and then we'll stir that in. All right, let's stir our culture in. You wanna stir back and forth as well as top to bottom. Put the lid on and start the timer for 45 minutes. All right, 45 minutes is up. Let's see if we've held that 86 degrees. We're actually a little high, 91. All right, I have my rennet. Remember, this is a half of the recipe in the book. So I have a 1/4 teaspoon rennet in an 1/8 cup of non-chlorinated water. So we're gonna put our rennet in and stir it up. And again, back and forth as well as top to bottom. So the first time we let that set for 45 minutes, we're just letting the culture certainly it rehydrates, but it works its way through the milk. The culture is what actually helps preserve the cheese, right? The cheese. It kind of preserves the milk into the cheese form. But it also helps give the cheese the desired flavor that you're looking for, depending upon the culture you're using. And so when you age cheese, right, it has to age for, a minimum usually of 2 months. And then some cheese is a lot longer than that. The longer it ages, the more the culture works through, changes the flavor to the desired outcome. We're gonna let that sit now. Our rennet is stirred in. We're gonna let that sit for 35 minutes. Okay, 35 minutes is up. Now, before we move to the next step, the next instruction in the book is, we're gonna cut the curds, we're gonna let them sit for 5 minutes, and then we're gonna stir. But before I do that, I actually put my teapot on the stove. It's on number 3 on my stove top. You wanna get, and again, we're having this recipe, so in the book it says 1 gallon. I have a half a gallon of water in my teapot, give or take, as close as I could get to half a gallon. And I want to bring that up to 130 degrees, because what we're going to be doing is, after we cut the curds to let them sit, we're going to stir them for 15 minutes. And again, this is to release as much of the whey, the acid, out as possible. We're then going to pour off some of that whey and replace it with this 130 degree water. The hotter the water, the higher the temp of the curds, the drier the cheese will be. And we want to get our curds between 95 and 100. So I just wanted to let you know I've got my half a gallon of water on the stove top in the teapot right now, warming up. Let's cut the curds. Okay, so we'll take this off. Remember, we were a bit higher in the temperature last. Let's see where we are. At 90, so still a little bit higher, but okay. Don't get hung up on the temperature if it gets a few degrees higher, right? There's only so much you can control. So I am now going to cut these into, it says 3/8 of an inch cube. So I'm going to go first this way. Again, get as close as you can to the correct measurement. And now I'm going to go in crosswise. I'm going to let this sit for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and stir. All right, 5 minutes is up. I want you to see, can you see the whey that has collected up top here? This is why you cut the curds and let them sit, because they will start to release some of that whey. So now we're gonna just start stirring. I am going to keep my put my timer on for 15 minutes, because that is how long we want to stir our curds for. And as I'm stirring, if I see that I have curds that are obviously bigger, I'm just gonna quickly chop them up, because as you stir and as the curds get harder, it will become a little bit more difficult to make them smaller in size. So I would recommend that if you see some larger curds, right, get them smaller when you have that opportunity. And we're not touching the temperature right now on the stove, right? The stove is still off. Our curds are around 92. They should go down a couple of degrees just from the stirring here. Okay, so I'm not going to film this for 15 minutes for your benefit. That would be rather boring, but I will continue to stir these off and on for 15 minutes straight, and then we'll come back when that 15 minutes is up. Okay. 15 minutes is up. You can see a lot of the whey has risen to the top as the curds have expelled more. So I stopped stirring at about 1 to 2 minutes prior to that 15-minute timer going off, because I did want some of the curds to really start to settle and let as much whey come to the top. We're going to take this to the sink. We're going to pour off 1/3 of the whey, just kind of eyeball it. And then we're going to stir again for another 15 minutes before we add in our 130-degree water. And carefully pour off whey without losing your curds. Looks about right. Let's get this back on the stove. Okay, we are going to set the timer again for 15 minutes. We're going to stir through that 15-minute time period every couple of minutes. Because there is less whey in the pot, you have to be pretty vigilant with it, because you do not want the curds to just kind of clump together and become a single mass. So I would say just for this 15-minute period, try to be a little bit more on top of it than you were the last time. So we've come down a bit. All right, now is where we are going to start to add that 130-degree water. Now, the goal is to get your curds up between 95 and 100 degrees. And again, like I'd mentioned, the higher the temp, the drier the cheese. I don't necessarily know that I want my cheese super dry, so I'm probably going to stick around the 95, 96 degree temperature. We're going to start to add our warm water. Okay, we're at 95, 96 right there. I'm actually not going to add any more hot water at this point. I'm going to leave it at that temperature. But now we're going to intermittently stir again for 20 more minutes. All right, before I start my timer, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of Redmond real salt. Stir that in, and then we will start our timer for 20 minutes. 20 minutes is up. It is time to finally get our curds out of the pot. So I have cleaned my sink. In the sink, I have a clean colander with a very clean piece of butter muslin cheesecloth, and we are going to spoon our curds out into the cheesecloth lined colander and let that sit for about 10 minutes to drain. After it's drained, we will then mix in our dill. I'm using dried dill today because that's what I've got. And then we'll put it in our cheese mold. Okay, I'm gonna let that sit for 10 minutes. Okay, our 10 minutes is up here with our curds. Make sure you have very clean hands. I'm just gonna loosen this a little bit because it has become a bit of a mass, and I want to get my dill spread throughout. So I'm just breaking up the curd mass. Going to start with a heavy tablespoon of dried dill and mix that around. Okay, I'm gonna get my cheesecloth up here and we're gonna put it right into our mold. I will change my cheesecloth when I flip it in about 30 minutes. We're only going to be doing about 8 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes before we flip it and rewrap. So we'll come back in 20 minutes. Okay, our 20 minutes is up. I am going to take this out of the mold, rewrap it with some clean cheesecloth, flip it, and so that the bottom is now on the top, and we're gonna press at 16 pounds pressure, and we're gonna do this for 2 hours. However, in those 2 hours, every 30 minutes, we're going to flip it, right? Rewrap and flip. And so for that 2-hour period, we're at 16 pounds pressure. Please forgive my dirty sink area. I am trying to do dishes now while the cheese is pressing. Okay, I've got my clean piece of cheesecloth here. Now what's cool about the mold I'm using, it's called a Gouda or an Edam mold, and it basically tries to create a very round ball of cheese. I think it's pretty snazzy, so that's what I'm using today. So I'm putting my clean cheesecloth on top, flipping, and you'll see we have variation on how the dill is distributed. Putting it back in, pulling up the ends. So when the 2-hour period is up, remember every 30 minutes we're flipping, but when that 2-hour period is up, we're actually going to take the mold out of the press. We're not taking the cheese out of the mold, but we are going to submerge the entire mold, probably in my big cheese pot here, in 65-degree water. So room temperature water tonight. I'm going to leave that on the counter, but really have it submerged. So I'll have to weigh the mold down and leave it for 8 to 10 hours. So we're submerging our Havarti in the mold in water. I'll show you when we get to that point. Okay, the 2 hours is up. The mold is behind me in the press. I'm going to take it out. So basically, by reading the instructions in the book, right, is that we're going to actually take it out of the mold, take the cheesecloth off of the cheese, put the cheese back in the mold, and then put the mold in our bucket. I got my bucket here with 65-degree water on the counter. And so we're submerging the mold with the cheese inside, no cheesecloth, for about 8 to 10 hours, which means I will be getting up at sometime around midnight and taking this out of the water. And at that point, I'll be putting it in my saturated brine. So I'll put it in the brine, salt the top, and then go back to bed, and then I'll flip it about halfway through. So I'll be setting up my alarm again. We're gonna keep it in the brine for 5 to 6 hours. So between the 2.5 to 3 hour mark, I'll come downstairs, I'll flip it, salt the exposed side again, go back to bed. And then in the morning, we'll take it out of the saturated brine and let it air dry for a couple of days before we put it in the cheese cave. So let's get the cheesecloth off of the cheese now and get it back in the mold and in our water. I love how this mold creates this kind of like dome or ball of cheese. I think it is so pretty. So I'm going to put it back in gently. And put our mold in. Okay, I got some bowls here. I'm just gonna weigh this down so it stays on the bottom. So this is gonna stay for about, like I said, 8 to 10 hours, and then I'll take it out, put it in my saturated brine. It's gonna be in the brine for 5 to 6 hours, halfway through, flip it, right? Salt both exposed sides, and then I will see you in the morning. Good morning. It's time to flip the cheese. And so just kind of recap what we did last night, right? We submerged the cheese in the mold, in the water. It was about 65-degree water. It was 8 to 10 hours is what the recipe said. Truth be told, it went 13. My sleep is more important than the cheese, and it's fine. I want you to, as you're going through your cheese making journey, it's so easy, and I did this myself, to get really hung up on the exact time, the exact temperature. And yes, they are important. And they're not meant to be guidelines, right? They're meant to be followed in the way the recipes are written out. But please don't think that all is lost, right? If you get a couple of degrees over or a couple degrees under, or you go an hour or two longer. Like, it's not all is lost. It will be okay. So I say that because you just have to be forgiving of yourself, and life is life. All right, so this morning around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., I got up and I took the cheese out and I put it in my saturated brine. And so that's where it is now. I salted the top. I need to flip it and resalt the new exposed side. So that's what I'm gonna show you. I put this bowl on it because the lid to my dish didn't really work with me using that dome-shaped mold. But look how beautiful it is. It is such a beautiful Havarti. So we're gonna flip it. Oh, I love it. I love it. I love the shape. And again, I'm using Redmond Real Salt, and I'm just gonna salt the exposed surface. Cover it back up, and we'll take it out in about 2.5 to 3 hours. Okay, it's time to take our Havarti out of the brine. I've got a clean, sterilized rack here with a plate underneath just to catch any of the moisture that comes off. We are going to place our Havarti here. I'm going to put my picnic cover on top, and this is going to dry out from anywhere from 1 to 3 days. You'll start to see the Havarti maybe shrink a little bit just as the moisture escapes. There will be moisture that will collect in the plate below. I'll flip it twice a day, morning and night, and we're just going to let this really dry out, and then we'll vacuum seal it for the fridge. So I'll come back in a couple of days when this is fully dry, but it's about 1 to 3 days. Okay friends, it has been 3 full days with our Dill Havarti. I've been turning it twice a day around 6 a.m., 6 p.m., right? Every 12 hours, turning it. It has definitely flattened out a little bit, but it's become a lot more firm. It smells amazing. It's not wet on the surface. It might be a little tacky in the middle on both sides. But I don't see any more moisture coming out. If you can see the moisture that has pooled up over the 3 days, right? So that's why you flip it every day, and so that the moisture evenly distributes as well as comes out. So our cheese is looking great. So we are now going to vacuum seal this. I've got my vacuum seal bag ready. The reason we vacuum seal it, or at least the reason I do, is because it creates that perfect humid environment, right? Just the right humidity. So then all you have to worry about is temperature control. You always want to write on your bag what it is, and then I write the month and the year that I made it. So now in my cheese journal, I'll write down that I made this. I already started writing it down, right? What day I started making it, the recipe I followed, how many days it air dried, when it went into the cheese cave. I will probably open this in about 4 months. Around 4 to 6 months is a really good age time for Havarti. Minimum 2 for just about every cheese. The longer it ages, the drier it becomes, sometimes more sharp the flavor, depending upon the cheese and the cultures. But our Dill Havarti is ready for the cave. Thanks for joining me on today's cheese adventure. Don't forget to hit subscribe so that you can catch all of the latest videos as they come out. And I am putting all of the cheese making videos in a playlist. So make sure you check out that playlist also, where I start from introduction as far as the milk, the cultures, the equipment, the soft cheeses, and then into the hard cheeses where we are today. So thanks for joining me today. Stay healthy, stay well. Bye-bye.